Welcome to the inaugural episode of the Cyber Executive Podcast. I am your host, Mark Ashworth. Here at the Cyber Executive, we will be talking with executives all about things risk and leadership related. Today, I have the pleasure of having my dear friend Andrew Wilder with VetCor joining us. Andrew, thanks for coming and being on this spearheading of my podcast career here, I guess. So,
Mark, thanks so much, man. I remember when we first talked about this and you told me that you were starting a podcast and that I would have the opportunity to be on your first episode. I was really honored. So really glad to be here today. Looking forward to the discussion. And, as I was thinking back about our history of knowing each other, you and I have met around kind of panels and podcasts and all that kind of stuff. That's how things started. So it's interesting to see it kind of come full circle. And now here we are doing the first episode of your podcast together. So great to be
yeah.
here.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely been a fun journey. We've had lots of great discussions and everything over the years, and so it's great to have you here on the first one. So just to kind of get started, let's talk about cyber on boards. We hear a lot about it in the news. I don't know how much of it you've been seeing with CISOs being appointed to boards, or is it more the board members are getting cyber training for their existing members? What sort of things are you seeing out there in the industry dealing with that, since this has all been the hype, especially over the last couple of years?
Yeah. So I think the biggest thing was this SEC ruling about cybersecurity and boards and disclosures and things like that, and people being concerned about materiality. There was a clause in the original one, which you know about very well, which said that boards would be required to have cybersecurity expertise. And when they released the final version of that, that part had been excluded, which some of us in the cyber community thought that was probably not a very good idea. So I am seeing some CISOs, former CISOs, being appointed to boards, but it's not at the not at the level that I thought it might have been a while ago. And some of those kind of CISO board groups are becoming fairly saturated with people. And I think boards are looking for diversity of thought, and every board isn't going to have a former CISO on it. In terms of training, you asked about that. I am seeing a fair amount of that, and groups like NACD, which is kind of the premier board group, they offer some cybersecurity training. I know you're a member of that as well. So there are a lot of those things that are happening. Private Directors Association, they offer board cyber training too. So certainly you're seeing interest and people want to understand about it. Could we do better? Absolutely, Mark. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting on these where they're concerned around the cyber risk component of this, and you get a certificate of after 2 days of training, and that's okay. But then on the flip side, if you're going to be on a CISO or a CISO to be on a board, they want you to, let a company and everything else. So, it's kind of interesting, the pathway off of that, I think, and the mentality that, well, you can be an expert after two, but yet, so I think it's interesting. So do you think there's a certain industry where maybe there are more CISOs that are getting on the boards, maybe in the Silicon Valley area, those sort of things, or do you think it's kind of flat throughout?
So yeah, there are some, and there's a couple companies that I think are kind of cutting edge in terms of having cybersecurity or tech risk committees on their boards. FedEx has had this for a while on their board. Walmart has like a cyber risk or a technology risk committee on their board. So there are some kind of forward facing ones, but I think in terms of particular industry, I think you hit it on the head. Like it's the tech industry, because if you're selling technology, you have to be cybersecurity focused. You have to have that understanding of that risk more than other organizations. Other organizations definitely do too, but there's kind of a double-edged sword if you're a tech company, because if you look at things like solar winds, all of the different things that have happened with Microsoft, the patching that's released on a regular basis because of these 0 days for Fortinet and Ivanti and all these other companies. So not only do you have to understand cyber risk from your own company's perspective, but you have to understand cyber risk from a consumer perspective, because your products are being sold to consumers and could be kind of avenues for cyber attacks. And that's why we've seen these executive orders and different things coming out from the government talking about that software companies and technology companies need to be more responsible with cybersecurity in their products. Because is it really fair to hold accountable a business who buys a product and assumes that it's secure, and then they end up getting compromised and they have to go disclose to the SEC? That's why we saw I think it was Delta Airlines suing CrowdStrike because of their outage, right? I mean, is it really Delta Airlines' fault that they relied on CrowdStrike, or is it CrowdStrike's fault that Delta lost, tens of millions of dollars? It's an interesting kind of, where does the culpability lie in that scenario? So it's an interesting debate, but again, we have some companies that are kind of leading the way there, and hopefully other folks will catch on.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to see too on how the government's going to act. At the time of this recording, it's mid-January of 2025, right before the inauguration, and just yesterday there was a new executive order around cybersecurity that was done, and to push the government to put more. I think put their foot in the fire a little bit more on these third party companies and how that they're performing and handling cybersecurity, and forcing more FedRAMP and third party controls and that sort of things. And so it'll be interesting to see what the new administration will do, if they will enforce this, because there was a lot of good things in it, but it'll be interesting to see what's going to happen here going forward. Um, when you look at the industry as a whole and everything, uh, do you think that there's going to be any more adjustments of or more additions to executive risk leadership, whether it's CISOs, CROs, getting to the board, or do you think it's going to be more separating out between different committees and more board advisories, and bringing the company CISOs in more as an advisory role to meet those needs?
Honestly, Mark, I think it's going to be both. And I think it depends on the industry and the maturity of the company. Like we said before, there are some companies that are kind of leading the way in this area. And so I think as technology advances, as CISO becomes a ubiquitous thing across all companies, the evolution of CIOs getting onto boards. I mean, how recently has that happened? In the last 10 years, maybe 15 years? I mean, 20, 30 years, there wasn't a CIO on a board. And a lot of times CIOs didn't even report into the CEO. So there's an evolution that's happening, and how fast it's going to happen, I don't know. Now, the second part of your question was about this kind of special training and committees, and we're already seeing that. A lot of times, I know when you work with your board, you'll have a third party, some kind of a big four or somebody come in and say, hey, we did this cyber assessment and here's what we thought. And they want that. That gives them some kind of assurance. And it's good. You see the same thing from a SOX perspective. You have the audit committee, and there's always a third party auditor in there who comes in and talks about the financial stuff. So I think both of those things, and maybe we'll see some kind of combining of that in the future, or there will be a, similar to SOX, there will be a defined third party cybersecurity attestation company that will work with the assigned cyber committee or the tech risk committee or whatever it's going to be. That will be a requirement for publicly traded companies. And as you know, a lot of times those publicly traded company requirements end up coming to private companies because, well, maybe they have a wish to go IPO at some point, or maybe it's just they see it as best practice. That's my thinking on it.
Yeah, I agree. And, I think as, the role continues to mature, as well as availability of the resource too. I mean, there's not a lot of CISOs out there, a lot of CISO positions. And as, the, what, 40,000 plus companies or whatever that's, even publicly traded and stuff in the US, not all of them's going to require it. And it'll just continue to mature as, the industry does in general. So, let's shift a little bit here because
All
one
right.
of the things that I know you do a lot of, and both of us do for that matter, is mentoring others.
Yeah.
So, from a career perspective, what do you think the next step in the career path for a CISO is? So, someone who's aspiring to be a CISO or some C-suite level. What's some advice that you have for them?
So two different questions there. So the first one
Yeah,
is next
I got
next
to load
step
it up,
career
right?
path.
I can't just do one question. I got to have few.
That's right. You got to throw it at me. So next step career path, and then also what are the steps for someone that's aspiring to be a CISO? So happy to answer both of those things. So next step career path, I think there's a few different options. If you're looking at like within the business or kind of traditional career path, if you will, you could go CIO. We've certainly seen some CISOs go into the CIO role. That happened at Bank of America. I think it happened at Mars, where our mutual friend is at. There's a few times where we see that happening, and that's good because then you get a CIO who's really got that cybersecurity perspective and understands the other parts of the business and IT. Certainly can go into consulting. There's a lot of kind of debate about virtual CISO and what it takes to be a virtual CISO, and can you be a certified virtual CISO, and do you need to have been a CISO before, and all that stuff. But I really think from my recent experience of working with kind of medium-sized companies, it's clear that every company at a certain level of maturity needs an independent cybersecurity executive. And
Mhm.
whether or not you're large enough that you can afford to have a CISO or that you do, that's great. And if not, finding yourself a good independent virtual CISO, I think is something that you need to do. And we talked about this before as well, working on boards, right? Either training existing board members, serving on a board yourself, maybe at a tech company or a startup or something like that. Those are certainly next path career steps for a CISO. And the other thing that we're seeing more often is the going into some kind of startup world like venture capital, private equity, advising those different funds. There's a few people that we know and that we work with who've kind of gone towards that path. So that's another thing that you can consider too. To answer your more loaded question, which is what do we see for people that want to be a CISO? First, are you sure? But the second is I'm going to try and make it really simple. I'm just going to give two things. The first one is a quote that someone gave to me very early on in my career, which I really took to heart and I remember today and think about often, which is no one is going to care more about your career than you do.
Mhm.
I think a lot of people starting out think that HR or your manager is going to help you to advance in your career. Now, a good leader will probably do that for their people, but you should not assume that you're always going to be working for a good leader and you're always going to be looking for someone who's going to help you to advance. So, always thinking about that, always having a plan, knowing what you want to do next, having development goals, executing on those goals, and doing that yourself. And if you need to do it on your own free time or whatever, learning, constantly learning, or you become obsolete. So that's the whole, that part of it. The second thing, if you want to get into cybersecurity executive leadership, and that's what our podcast is about, right?
Mhm.
Uh, it's really about understanding business from a business perspective. If you want to have a seat at the table with the C-suite and with the board of directors, you need to be able to speak their language. You need to be able to understand a financial report, a 10K, an 8K. You need to be able to read that and see where a company is going. And you might think, well, that's impossible, or I can't do that. You can take a business finance course. You can probably find some that are free or very cheap, but understanding the business from a business perspective, understanding what their needs, what their desires are, and that will help you to be a much better cyber executive, because you can go into the board and say, look, I know our most important thing is this order to cash flow, and this is what we're doing to protect that, to make sure that that doesn't get attacked. And some of the other lesser things, we have a certain risk appetite, and we have less controls in those areas. So I think those are the two things that I would say is you need to care about your own career, and you need to understand business from a business perspective.
Yeah, I totally agree. And honestly, especially simple, if you break down management or executive managements to certain parts, certain different elements and stuff, something as simple as a financial statement, YouTube it.
Yep. Yep.
There's great things out there to help you understand a net income or balance sheet and all of those, and what to look for trending wise. And if you like, say, the finance industry or manufacturing or whatever it is, keep up with those industries and what's happening in it, and try to think ahead on what things are going to be to help you. That gets, and out of the technology, you got to step out of that technology hat and look into the business and really partner with the business more. um,
Absolutely.
Another part, we kind of touched on it initially, but find a mentor.
Yep.
If there's plenty of people out there that wants to help mentor others to get into a certain position, and it's a good way to do it. And I know when I was younger, that really wasn't there. And I think leadership is really kind of, or especially the last 10 years, have really gotten a lot better to help mentor, and truly be a leader and not just a manager. And frankly, a lot of managers don't know how to lead,
Yeah.
and that becomes a challenge in itself. So,
Yeah. My challenge to your listeners is, if you don't have a mentor today, go out and ask someone that you look up to, that you respect, that you want to be like in the future, that you want to emulate. Ask them to be your mentor. The worst thing that can happen is that they would say no. And
mhm,
the best thing that can happen is it can totally change your life and your career. I've had some great mentors. I know you have as well. I
mhm.
continue to mentor people, on a regular basis. And I know a lot of people who've done way better things than me, who are still going out there and mentoring others and giving back. And that's what we all want to do. I mean, it's the right
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah, and build your network up in general, because when you hear people talk, especially publicly or in peer groups and stuff. I mean, you learn so much, and it gives you that freedom to be able to ask, because now you're building that relationship to where it's comfortable to do that. And
Yeah.
I know we're parts of several big peer groups here in St. Louis, and there's definitely a handful of people when they start talking, my ears perk up, because when they say something, it's something really cool.
Yeah.
And that's where I strive to hope to be at some point, is that someone actually wants to listen to me, right? So we'll see on how this podcast goes, and on how much they want to listen to me, and the people that I think are really meaningful, like yourself, when we talk, right? So
I think you're going to be quite a success with it, Mark.
so we're talking about the industry a lot and stuff, but what do you think in our industry, in the security industry, that we could really do better in general?
So I'm going to talk about two things. The first thing is the system of hiring people. From the perspective of hiring a CISO, this process is super broken. And in fact, I contributed to an article on CISO Online that was published today,
Oh, nice.
um, about how hiring is broken. And there's a couple of quotes that I added to the article, or that I contributed. One was that all recruiting professionals should have to use their own application tool to apply for the job and see how well it works, with like reading the resume and entering all that stuff. I think those people should have to do that every time, because sometimes it's a real pain in the butt to go through that stuff. But the other part of it is kind of the opposite of that, is how easy it is to apply for so many jobs. And you see, like, I've talked to some peers who have tried to hire a CISO, or have been a recruiter for a CISO role, and they're like, we got like 1,000 resumes within a day, and of those, 900 of the resumes were totally unqualified, right? Just people just giving it this kind of wild shot. So I'm not saying you should only apply for jobs that you're qualified for. I would never say that. You should reach for the stars, kind of thing. But be reasonable. If you're a security analyst today, don't go apply to be the CISO of a big bank. That's probably not going to happen. So that's a challenge. So how do you, as a hiring manager, how do you separate the wheat from the chaff? How do you find the right people? And I'm going to talk about another thing that I think is kind of broken in the industry. And to me, the solution for both of these ends up being the same. The solution is network. So when I'm looking to hire someone, I go to our St. Louis CISO group and some other CISO groups that I'm a member of, and I say, hey, I'm hiring for this position. Do you know anybody who would be a good fit? And yeah, we've kind of gotten in trouble with stealing good talent from each other, but you know, that's where I will go first, because if you just go to the public, you're just going to get all this chaff, if you will. So the hiring process is broken, and I think there's some good ways that it can be fixed. The second thing that is really difficult is the tool buying process. And if I think about myself 10 years ago when I was trying to buy a tool, you know where I would go?
CDW.
Well, that's a big mistake too. I've done that and gotten in trouble too. Um, but where I would go in the past was I would go to Gartner and I would look at the
Yeah.
Magic Quadrant.
Mm-hmm.
And what I found out was some of those things are influenced in ways that at this point I don't really agree with.
Mm-hmm.
There, some of those analyst groups are kind of pay to play, and they're about relationships and things like that. So now, what I do if I want to buy a tool is I go to my peers and I say, "What tools do you like in this area?" And then I get real people feedback. And before I buy anything, I talk to people who are using that solution and finding out, because the only way besides that you know how it's going to work is if you have a problem, right? If you're getting like a SIM or a SOC or an MDR or whatever, you're not going to know how well they work until you have a big incident. And I don't want to find out how well it works during the middle of a big incident, right? I want to know from my peers ahead of time whether something is good. So I think that is difficult, and especially if you're a CISO or you're a cybersecurity professional who doesn't have a good network, how are you going to go and find what are the right tools for you? That's the challenge. So those I think are two things that the industry could do better.
Yeah, and I will say that there's been many of times I've been looking at a tool and be talking to a peer at a conference or a gathering of some sort, and they would either just be getting off of it and give you some insight of their support or something that's happening that you would not have gotten during the sales process. And
Yep.
I will say that happened as little as about 4 or 5 months ago, that we totally shifted directions from a product that we thought was pretty good, but then we found out the support was terrible,
Yeah.
and that
And
was a big
if you
decision
ask
maker
the
for us.
vendor to give you someone to talk about, they're going to give you their most satisfied customer, and it's not going to be a very good review. So, I highly recommend finding customers on your own and talking to them and getting the real scoop on stuff.
Yeah, and I'll say one thing that I feel that as an industry we could do better is, if we're going to release a product, whether it's a router or a piece of software or something like that, that since we can't get away from passwords, it needs to have multi-factor associated with it of some sort. And there's too many things that is being released that just does not do that and relies strictly on password, or not have single sign-on capabilities if they're trying to sell to an enterprise. And so that's something that I think the industry could definitely do better off of that. So
I saw a meme yesterday of thousands of people rushing into a door and one door that nobody's going into. And the door with thousands of people rushing in said, "Another posture management tool that gives me alerts." And the one with nobody going in, it says, "Actually implementing phishing resistant MFA."
yeah, that's great. So We talked about what we could do better, but what is something that you're tired of hearing about?
I'm tired of hearing the two letters AI. Now, you and I gave a keynote on generative AI and cybersecurity, which still a lot
Yeah,
of times frames the way that I think about it, kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly side. But it's so embedded in so many things now, and so many people are putting into their sales hype cycle, and all of these kind of phrases that we've heard about, shift left and zero trust and cloud first, and every year or 2 years you get some other name that's inserted into the hype cycle of people selling. So it's hard to hear about it constantly. There are some amazing things that it's doing. I read a great book. I'm not sure if I told you about this or not, by a guy named Ethan Mollick. He's a professor who teaches an MBA course, and he has all of his students heavily use generative AI in the course. And he was giving a keynote at a conference that I was at, and it was so riveting that I bought his book during the keynote speech, and it was delivered to me the next day. So
very
really
cool.
interesting stuff that you can do with it. And, I think a lot of us are just kind of scratching the surface of it, but there
Mhm.
will be some major things that are going to happen with it soon. But boy, I'm kind of sick of hearing about it at this point. I don't know about you, Mark.
Oh, absolutely. I'm so tired of it, and it's been what almost a full year now, maybe a little more since ChatGPT hit all the news and stuff off of it, and I think uh, we're starting. I guess it's almost 2 years now. So we're starting to finally settle down a little bit about the hype, and now maybe we'll see some actual business applications that is going to be worthwhile, something other than a chatbot,
Yeah,
and those type of areas, which I think does provide some good value. But we've been hearing for years that well, this has AI in it and stuff, and it's just marketing because it's really just machine learning or rule
hmm,
based, and it's not truly. So it'll be. I think it'll be interesting now to where the hype is calming down, and we can actually sit back in our organizations and see, okay, well maybe this, and this makes sense to have AI do it, and the next thing will be to be able to implement that at a cost effective manner,
yeah,
because that's the biggest thing, is that the cost of either implementation or ongoing cost, if it's truly using an AI model, is really cost prohibitive over a long period of time. So you really have to be able to have that ROI in there from a business perspective, which is going to be challenging, I think.
yeah, yeah. I think we'll see more and more companies build their own on-premise or private cloud AIs that they can safely load their own company data into, so that they can use that to make decisions and drive processes and stuff. But there's going to be a lot of craziness as technology expands constantly. The cybersecurity controls and needs around those technologies expand along with them. So it's more
Yeah.
stuff that we're going to need to help with.
Yeah, I heard a great podcast from on the Security Now podcast. It was the first week of January, I believe, and he did a great explanation, a deep dive into the different types of AI and where it's going and everything, and he actually even changed his opinion of AI, where things are at and stuff. But he did the research and everything off of it. And I think the biggest thing to come out of that is, that podcast next month will be totally out of date. It's
That's right.
growing so fast. I mean, I think about our keynote that we did about a year or so ago. That thing is so far out of date that it's unbelievable,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
it's definitely the most rapidly growing industry. But I agree, I am just so sick of that two-letter initial. you know
Yep. Yeah. It's
and
hard to get away from it.
yeah, but we have to embrace it, right? So because it's
Yeah.
here, it's not going away. So but I think unlike the blockchain side of things, that was going to solve all the world's problems, I do think AI has a little bit better chance of fixing a lot of things and
Me
improving
too.
things. And then also, driving a lot of additional work, that people do, and people be able to work smarter on top of it. So.
Agreed.
Okay, so this it's January this time that we're recording this and stuff. So it's always a good time to reflect on the last year and the upcoming year and stuff. So what do you think is going to be the big trends here for 2025 from a cyber risk perspective?
So one of the things that we keep hearing more and more about, and it depends on what articles you read and who you listen to, but one thing that I think we might want to start preparing for is quantum, right? So are we getting ahead of that? And mostly we're talking about encryption around quantum computers. But as those become cheaper and easier to get access to, a lot of nation state hackers have stolen encrypted data with the knowledge or the hope that as quantum computing becomes cheaper, they'll just be able to break those encrypted databases in the future using quantum computers. So maybe a cyber attack that you read about from or didn't read about, in the last 3 or 5 or 10 years, that data that we might think, oh, that nothing's ever going to happen to that could be released in the future. So how do you make sure that your encryption is up to quantum? And as that happens, those encryptions are going to be broken and new stuff is going to have to come out. There'll be that kind of cat and mouse game that happens with encryption as it does already. Of course, AI is going to be a trend. One of the things I like to think about with AI is something like Uber. So how long before Uber came out did people have cars and did we have like GPS on our phones? Right? It was a while before someone just put those two kind of simple things together to make something that now is ubiquitous and everybody's using all over the place. So how soon is somebody going to be able to put generative AI or some other flavor of AI with something else that we already have and create this kind of standard thing that everybody will be using pretty quickly? I don't think there's going to be a long time before that happens. Another thing that we hear a lot about, and you and I have talked about this in our keynote and at other times, is this concept of data is the new gold rush or data is the new oil. You know, if you think about a cyber attack, what are they after? They're after your data, and they're after your data because you want it back. So you can talk about these double or triple extortion ransomwares where they get you to pay the ransomware to unlock your machines, and then they get you to pay another ransom to get your data back that they've stolen. And there's also a lot of laws and regulations around data. So, you have to disclose, and if things get stolen, you can have huge fines. So I think protecting data, knowing our data, understanding our data, because data is, the amount of data that we have as individuals, as companies, and as countries is just growing exponentially all the time. There's so much data that's happening. So how do we know where that is? How do we know who has access to it? How do we protect it? And the fourth one that I'm seeing a lot of is the idea of non-human identities. So right now, we're pretty good at protecting human identities. We have these connections between our HR systems and our IAM systems. We know who's who. We're checking these things. But APIs, machine accounts, service accounts, all of those different things that are not tied to a human being, if those things get attacked or start acting weird, there's not someone sitting behind the keyboard to say, hey, Mark, people are saying they're getting weird emails from me, right? That's not going to happen. So, and those are growing fast as well. Like every new product that you get has API connections to all of your other products. And it's just this intertwining thing that just keeps growing and growing. So figuring out how to protect those and like rotate passwords or go beyond passwords, things like that. I think those are the four areas that I see. I'd love to know from your perspective, what do you see happening this year? Anything that I missed?
Yeah, I think there's going to be some additional on the issues on the threat side. So I think there's going to be a lot of contention between the U.S. and probably China. We've already seen with the telco hacks that occurred or that became knowledge, I guess, in November, December. I foresee more of those state-sponsored attacks to try to grab additional intelligence, intellectual property, those things occurring. And especially if we do start hitting China very heavy on tariffs, I think that's really going to be a big thing that's really going to hit our universities and large businesses that's doing a lot of research. The other thing too, I think we're going to see, a continual increase on will be on the fraud side.
Yeah.
Just more and more opportunities for fraud. AI or generative AI is definitely helping with that, making it more efficient to do that and more effective. There was also just a recent malware. I forgot the name of it already, but that was confirmed to have been developed through AI and distributed from it. And even the C2 servers and everything that was associated with it was all part of that. Now, it wasn't as effective as maybe one would have thought, or in comparison to, more man-made related, but that's going to change, I think, very quickly, as we've been, just talked about, that the industry is changing so fastly or so quickly on the AI side. So I think those
Mm.
are a couple of areas that we'll see. And I think also it'll be, it can go one way or another, where they're going to see some deregulation in the industry in the U.S., or we're going to see more regulation in it. But it kind of depends on which article that you're reading on where the new
Yeah.
administration is going. So,
Yep.
I do think that there was a lot of good headways. It's one of the few things I'll say that's, happened really good in our industry over the last few years.
Yeah.
That there's been some good steps that has occurred, and hopefully we can keep that momentum and pull that in, as well as on a privacy standpoint. I think the U.S. got to do better on the individual privacy and holding the companies accountable for these data brokers that are leaking billions of records, and they was a one person shop. So
Yep.
that's just terrible. So it'll be
Absolutely.
interesting to see. And it's always exciting in the cyber. That's what makes this such a fun industry and such a fun position, right? Is to it's constantly changing and evolving, much faster than I'll even say more than what AI is doing right now, because you never know what's going to happen here in the cyber front. So
Yeah. What other C-suite role do you have with a risk that is constantly changing?
yeah.
I can't think of one.
Yeah, other than maybe like a chief risk officer or something like that, or a credit officer, that the markets are constantly going up and down. But even that is, I think, a little bit more stable, and could
Agreed.
be. I guess as long as your portfolio is good, then it's not as stressful as what waking up to a news article to find out that there's you know uh, three vendors of yours just got hacked and everything else. So.
Yep. Agreed.
Well, Andrew, thank you very much for being here with me today in the inaugural podcast. And as always, I appreciate your insights and looking forward to many, many more.
It's been an honor and a pleasure. Thanks, Mark. Cheers, man.
Thank you.